Music. It all begins in Kirin village, where this boy, our protagonist, is saying that he needs to. Debts are really too much for her to handle. The protagonist, already understanding why she broke up with him, tells her that he understands, but he has a question for her. If, intercepted again by the assassin, who tells the president that she cannot escape and simply has to obediently suffer her death. Upon seeing, the assassin was armed, and her bodyguard told both her and the protagonist that they had to leave immediately, as she would hold the assassin back. For a moment, the protagonist refused, wondering how he, a man, or rather, a great man, could allow her to run away. However, she told the protagonist not to be ridiculous, reminding him that when he faced Liu Yuan, she had retreated, and he was the one who stood up like a man, asking how she could let him do everything alone. After saying this, the president convinced the protagonist to leave. However, as they tried to retreat, they were blocked by several more assassins. He signaled to the protagonist and the president, telling them to stop fighting, since everyone was about to die, and were told that the major assassin, Black Star, is responsible. However, he and his companion ended up being beaten by the president's bodyguard, who insisted on clearing the path herself. Lashing out at him, she declared that with her present, no one would dare cause a scene, and as he was about to be struck by the president's bodyguard, he realized there was a miscalculation, because Yelin had a companion by the president's bodyguard, who said that they should let her lead the way. Lashing out at him, he came and said that, with her there, who would? He dares to make a scene, and when he was about to be hit by the president's bodyguard, he thinks that there is a calculation error, since Yelin has a teacher at her side. However, we can see how he managed to dodge her attack. And if you're wondering how she could have missed such an apparently certain attack, I'll explain. She actually has very little skill. The assassin, already aware of this, seizes the opportunity presented by her failure and proceeds. He can return the money he gave her earlier, but she ends up hanging up on him when he says that, and at this point, the protagonist doesn't, which looks so accurate. Well, I explain to you. It has very little skill. The murderer, already knowing this, proceeds to take advantage of its failure and proceeds to give him a big blow to the stomach, and while bracing himself, he told the president that she had to hand over the USB, which causes the president asks the assassin if Liu Yun sent him, and if so, to tell her how much he paid him, because she was going to double it. However, the assassin tells him that he doesn't want money and only wants the USB drive or his life, to which the protagonist, while holding a kind of card, he thinks he has no choice but to take a risk and try it out. And if you're wondering how the protagonist obtained that, well, apparently, it was also part of the rewards. And, as the protagonist activated the card, he reveals that it is Hilam's reward, divine speed, which allowed him to save the president with a well-aimed shot and, throwing the president aside, tells her not to worry about it, since he will take care of it. However, they were surprised by what the protagonist did, especially since he physically dodged bullets. He wonders what kind of movement that was. Well, what kind of movement was that? It seemed too unreal. However, no matter how much the assassin shot at him, the protagonist couldn't land a single bullet despite his perfect aim. Perfect, which makes him doubt his own marksmanship. And when the assassin ran out of ammunition, the protagonist quickly seized the opportunity to deliver a powerful blow. He has no choice but to lament his current situation. And yes, our protagonist is incredibly lucky because, while carrying and holding a pendant, he mentions that hit to his face. However, he is surprised to see that the assassin feels no pain, and, taking advantage of the book's power again, he delivers another big blow to the face. This was said to the protagonist while telling him that he can only run and has no real abilities whatsoever. Well, he doesn't. Real skills at all, questioning what fear one might have of someone without any abilities. In response, the president asks the protagonist if he is all right, to which the protagonist replies that he is, while adding that it's a shame he's only fast, and it would be nice if he could do other combat-related things. However, we then see someone peeking out that someone was the bodyguard of the chairwoman. The protagonist, confused, asks her what she was doing, and she responds by telling him that she could defeat him quickly if the protagonist used her foot, telling him to carry her to victory, but the assassin wasn't going to allow that to happen and tells the same that B will not fail. However, working together in a great combination, they manage to inflict significant damage on the assassin, thus giving him a large amount of blows, which makes the other assassin jealous of the great combination of attacks that the protagonist and the girl were executing. And just when it seemed to be the end of the assassin, the other assassin ends up preventing it. With great speed, she manages to cut the president's bodyguard and, now holding the knife to the president's neck. The only thing his mother left him was that pendant, but the day before, he had taken it to the pawn shop, thinking that pawning it would. President on her knife, she tells her to give him the memory and he will let her go, or else he will kill her immediately. But the president tells the protagonist realizes this is his best opportunity to change things, that he must take the USB drive and go to the police. However, the murderer tells him the same thing, to shut her up once and for all, or else. Faced with this, the protagonist tells the murderer that it's enough, and throwing the memory stick at her, he says, to let her keep the flash drive, but to let the president go. But she, taking the memory stick, tells the protagonist that she will first verify the authenticity of the USB drive, and that he has to wait before releasing the president. But the president herself, with tears in her eyes, tells the protagonist that it's $180 billion, and he didn't hesitate to give it to him, asking him why. But the protagonist responds that it is for the simple fact that he can. You can still earn money, even if you lose it, but you only have one life. He thought this while being absolutely convinced she was the queen of work. It's worth much more than $180 billion. And after the assassin verifies the information on the USB drive, she ends up releasing the president. Seeing that the president is okay, the protagonist tells her bodyguard and her that they should accompany her, which makes the president think that it seems she's with the right person. And after they leave, we see how, several minutes later, the girl was handing over, make him some money. However, he never imagined it would be fake, but hitting the table, he says that crying won't help, and he has to face the memory to the assassin, telling him that the last mission he promised him has been completed, and according to their agreement, he is now free to leave the organization and quit being an assassin, to which his partner replies that he agrees, but asks him a question. Why did he let him go? Right at that moment. However, she doesn't respond, and only tells him to keep his word. Nevertheless, the assassin ends up betraying the girl, and we see him shooting her in the shoulder. Just as he was preparing to deliver the final blow, he says that she knows all the organization's secrets and still thinks she can get away with this. And to him that is impossible. And just as he was about to send the girl to hell, she counterattacks, seizing the opportunity to jump out of a window. He quickly orders his men to hunt her down, saying that even if they have to scour the earth, they must find the girl and eliminate her. The next day, the protagonist, hungover and walking, notices the girl, who is inside his house. After the protagonist sees the assassin lying on his couch, he wonders where this woman came from, and notices that she's injured. He literally doesn't recognize who she is, and, approaching her, he observes that she appears to be seriously injured, which makes him wonder if he should take her to the hospital. Without reality, and he can't just sit around and wait. Putting on his jacket, he tells us that there are still 6 months until the trial, and the only person who can save him is. However, he doesn't have enough money for the fee, well, the registration fee. Nevertheless, the system window appears, telling him towards the protagonist because the system detects that the host needs assistance, asking if he wants to use items and showing him a kind of pill. He tells him that it's a rejuvenation ointment, costing 5 intimacy points, which makes the protagonist think that he only has 7 days left to live and still needs those 5 points to extend his life after the timer expires. However, he can't bear to see such a beautiful woman die before his eyes, but he still questions whether to save her, since he thinks surviving a few days is better than saving someone else, and with a wide smile, he thinks that maybe it would be nice for her to play poker with him before she dies. Gratitude, and to see if the protagonist plans to help this beauty, especially since we can see how he ends up exchanging his points for the letter. Well, based on what the system was offering him, and after the protagonist placed what he exchanged from the system on her wound, we can see how the wound quickly healed, allowing her to open her eyes. Seeing this, the protagonist remarked that it was so incredible, since it didn't even leave a scar, while the girl was blushing, because she thought the protagonist was looking at her breasts, but we already know that the Kieran group now belongs to that woman, and if he manages to catch her, there might be a hope requirement. Time passes, and the protagonist finds himself in front of. Protagonist was only looking at her wound, and covering herself a little. She tells the protagonist that he had seen enough, which surprises him. Since he hadn't expected the girl to wake up so quickly, the protagonist wants to clear up any misunderstandings, which is why he tells her that he didn't. He looked on purpose, as he only did it to save her life. However, the girl simply asks him if he doesn't recognize her, but the protagonist doesn't recognize her, and asks if they've met before, leading her to believe that it seems the protagonist doesn't recognize her because the mask she was wearing fell off. She looks around, asking him where she is, to which the protagonist replies that she's at his house, and uses the opportunity to ask why she came to his house so badly injured. However, she doesn't respond to the protagonist at all, and standing in front of a door, she tells him that she will be living there from now on, which makes him. The protagonist tells her that she kindly saved him, and asks how she can do this to him, and if anything, she is the one invading, but she responds by throwing a wad of bills in the protagonist's face, telling him that he was going to rent it out, or rather, that he was going to rent the room, to which the protagonist, being a little more friendly, tells her that she can stay as long as she wants. This was while he was thinking that it is sad to think that the young, a large company, and looking at the image displayed before him, the protagonist says that the woman's name is Jelan, the president of the Galaxy Group, and she is master of his esteemed family would lower himself for 5 buckets of rice. However, he's not stupid enough to pass up that money. After a while, the protagonist, already settled in his favorite armchair, mused that, with the girl's rent covered, there was no need to worry about food, since the top priority is finding a way to prolong his life, revealing that there are 2 primary methods for increasing lifespan. One is through the goddess of contract, which can be obtained simultaneously, and the other is exchanging intimacy values with the contracted goddess. He has already completed the contract with Yelan, and only by staying close to her can he live a long time. However, speaking of her, the protagonist then receives a call from Jen Lan, and upon answering, the protagonist asks her if she's available, as he wants to meet for coffee. However, she turns him down. He tells the protagonist that there is no time and abruptly hangs up, which greatly surprises and shocks the protagonist, who is left wondering why. However, after a few seconds, the protagonist decides to return to the matter, and showing us these windows, informs us that Angela May holds the title of OD bodyguard, and her reward is Divine Fist plus Precision, while the other person, who remains hidden from view, reveals that her name is the Cosign Assassin, and her title is Cold-Blooded Murderer, with a reward of Smash plus Eagle Eyes. Faced with this information, the protagonist, known as the Working Queen, because she turned the Galaxy Group profitable in only 1 quarter, smiling, he declares that this woman is now his, says that he knows Angela May, but he doesn't know the other assassin's location, and furthermore, she is a murderer, which is frightening. Shifting the scene to the assassin's study, they found themselves being reprimanded by their boss, who was asking them what they were doing, since not only did they fail to catch the person, but the incomplete CPD, things were lost, and he was asking if they were all garbage. But a mysterious person appears and tells him to calm down, then addresses this beautiful girl, telling her not to let those rude people affect her mood. And this girl, who is extremely attractive, is the president of Jman, Lin, the one with the yellow hair, who is the same one that the protagonist had previously kicked out of the hospital, tells the beautiful lady that Yelan has requested police protection, so it will be difficult to attack her again, asking him not to be anxious, which causes the beautiful girl to sit down next to him and tell him not to worry, because her objective is to take money from others and help him free himself from his problems. She tells him that she will take care of everything for him, and he, already intrigued by what the girl was saying, asks her how she plans to solve that, which, approaching him, he tells him that Yelan has a close relationship with her bodyguard, but that bodyguard urgently needs money for his younger sister, and that they just have to start with her. Time passes, and we shift to the protagonist and Yelan's bodyguard. She. Objective. Just then, the protagonist gets bumped into by this mysterious girl, and when the protagonist tries to get her attention, she simply asks the protagonist why he wanted her to come out, to which the protagonist responds that he would like her to become his personal bodyguard, and he wonders if it's possible. And without much thought, she replies that, of course he can, which surprises the protagonist, who, he asks if she's really being serious, to which the girl responds by asking him to give her $1 million, and, not to mention, she'd be his bodyguard. She could even be his girlfriend, because of course, with that amount he's asking for, who wouldn't? The protagonist then asks how she knows that he's bankrupt and doesn't have that kind of money right now, and that's why he asks what she thinks about giving him double the compensation when Jelan wins, and with that, he starts to leave. The protagonist tells him not to talk to him if he doesn't have money, since he has other things to do, to which the protagonist tells her that they can't only talk about money, since they need to have lofty ideals. However, when the protagonist tried to stop her, the same girl ended up throwing the protagonist far away again. Faced with this, The protagonist thinks that the value of intimacy and affection was not achieved. The contract was unsuccessful, so he will take Asu 5.0 pills. Well, I don't know what that is, but it's probably a pill that will literally send you to the afterlife. The protagonist is already giving up hope. 6 days later, the protagonist, who had lost all hope of living, said that it is useless, since, get money, because he claims he's too young to go to jail, or else he won't pass the political exam. The protagonist tells us A, continues on her way, and he wonders if she's even a woman, considering how strong she is. But, as she walks away, he just thinks he's unlucky. However, his life will end at 12 midnight. However, someone ends up appearing behind him, telling him that he had a nice villa, which possessed the world-famous paintings. However, the protagonist realizes that the voice speaking to him belonged to Miss Yelan, who, turning around, says to him, the very person who had finally arrived, well, she herself had appeared with a beautiful smile. The protagonist tells her that he has been clearing up the old accounts of the Kirin Group these past few days, and after all, it's a large company, since it actually allowed him to recover 800 million in investment funds and 200 million in bridge commission. Well, bridge commission. And it's a shame that it's a drop in the bucket, and even with tens of thousands of millions, it can still make a difference. The protagonist, very grateful, tells Miss Yelan that, as she knows, what he wants isn't money, since he just wanted to see her as soon as possible, prompting her to ask the protagonist if he wasn't moving too fast. Because of this, the protagonist, he was able to get 10 intimacy points, which he can redeem for 10 days of life. She, blushing deeply, tells the protagonist that she also wanted to see him too, which makes the protagonist think he can live a few more days. However, the conversation is interrupted by the blue-haired girl, who asks the protagonist, or rather, tells him it's time to eat. The protagonist, realizing this, knows he's already messed up, since a mysterious girl suddenly appears on the top floor of a building and, pulling out some weapons, or rather, a rifle, announces that it is almost time. Forgot that there is a beautiful tenant in his house, and here we can see how the system informs the protagonist that he has lost 10 intimacy points, and the 10. A very upset girl tells the protagonist that her boyfriend is apparently beautiful, or rather, so beautiful, which is what the protagonist wants. To fix things, he tells Miss Yelan that she is not his girlfriend, all while thinking that he still hasn't had time to redeem the value of intimacy. However, the protagonist is saved by the bell, as a message arrives for her, saying that there were problems because his bodyguard was fighting at the boxing gym, and he had to go there quickly. There was trouble, as his bodyguard was fighting in the boxing gym, and he had to quickly go there. She knows very well that her bodyguard, he must have gotten into underground boxing to pay his sister's medical bills, but she's been so disoriented lately that she can't even fight in the ring, and if he does, death is certain. Faced with this, the protagonist suggests she should call the police. However, she tells him to wait because fighting in the black ring is illegal, and she'll be arrested if she calls the police. It would be better if he went to talk to Liu Yuan, or rather, his bodyguard. Backs. In response, the protagonist tells her he'll go with her. He thinks to himself that he has worked too hard to win her over, to give her up so easily, give her away so easily. As the protagonist and Elan were leaving, she complained that she can't even think about having a few days of peace. Moving on to the grand, here we are told that this girl, who is quite attractive, is a cosign assassin. Yes, you heard right, a cosign assassin, and the person she was going to assassinate was in her club. We see the president's bodyguard failing to land any of her attacks, which only provokes him to lash out at her even more. I was wondering if she happened to be the female version of a blind monk. Seeing that the protagonist and the president were there, the girl asks him the same question. What brought him there? To which the brutish man responded that she should hurry up and agree to be his bodyguard, prompting her to ask him, the protagonist, if he was crazy, since he was about to be murdered and still wanted her to be his bodyguard, asking him if he didn't think it was pointless, but the protagonist, quickly grabbing her hand and placing it on the contract, told her that there was no time, since, anyway, he was almost finished, asking him why he didn't sign the contract while doing that before he died, telling him that it would assure him that if he signs the contract, it will immediately help him win the game. After doing so, the protagonist causes the system to finally appear, saying, with the contract with the beautiful bodyguard now confirmed, he successfully obtained 7 extra days of life, plus Divine Fist, for both parties involved. Meanwhile, the girl, now the protagonist's bodyguard, asked him how he was going to help her, to which the protagonist replied that she didn't need to, should worry, as he has his own tricks. After placing the card the system had given him, the protagonist, sights the president of the Jing group, or rather, the Galaxy group, who was accompanied by her bodyguard, Ma, the protagonist, who was waiting for, he could quickly see a blow coming, and without hesitation, dodged it, making you wonder how he dodged it. But she, turning and with incredible speed, she ends up delivering a powerful kick to his jaw, sending him flying. The girl, impressed by what she just did, she explains to us that she can accurately distinguish her enemy's ki, which is amazing. Approaching the protagonist, she tells him that it was incredible. Meanwhile, we could see 10 intimacy points being added to the protagonist's stats. Faced with this, the protagonist only said that finally, after that night, the gate of hell is closed to him. He thinks this while realizing that even after exchanging 10 intimacy points, he only has 17 left. Days of life, and he still has to get closer to the two goddesses. The president, to encourage him, tells him that she bet all her money on him 80 times over. The odds are in their favor, and therefore he shouldn't miss this. While the protagonist was impressed, he asks him if, perhaps he thinks she's gambling too much by betting so much, but even so, he tells the girl that he likes her bet. The girl, very confident in herself, says that she is now the protagonist's bodyguard and has to protect the Kirin group, and that she will definitely win upon her return. The boy who was kicked by Miss M was trying to get up. However, she ignores him and, turning her gaze towards the protagonist, asks him, the president. Upon seeing her, he decides to approach her. However, he is stopped by her bodyguard. In response, the protagonist tells the president that he has, if he isn't the outside help, and, if so, he needs to get up there quickly. When she gets into the ring, she is surprised by how high it is. The people they were watching everything, thinking his death was brutal, or rather, was going to be brutal. However, she ends up attacking the large man while he commented that height doesn't matter, as it depends on whether or not he's strong enough. However, we can see that the girl's attack had no effect on the large man, who, grabbing her by the neck and throwing her to the ground, tells her that she has an inflated ego, and while he was dragging her across the ground, the large man told her that the floor is dirty, so he'll use her to clean it, and while the girl was being brutally dragged across the floor, she only begged her little sister for forgiveness, since she couldn't help her pay for her medication, all while thinking that she truly did all that she could. The yellow-haired man, who had been watching everything, points at the protagonist and asks if he has already seen the end, offending him and adding that he will take away his million, ensuring he can never turn his life around. However, the protagonist, looking at him, only wonders what role he is pretending to play, while thinking that he is now a system and destiny itself, and that his fate is in his hands and he will never let the girl be lost. Therefore, the protagonist yells at her to grab the rope net, which she ultimately does, and thanks to this, she manages to get away from the bully, or rather, a billion-dollar business proposition, and would like to have an in-depth discussion with her, asking if she could spare him 10 minutes of her time. The big guy, managing to do a backflip. However, the big guy wasn't going to let the girl get away with it and ends up attacking against her, managing to create a huge explosion in the ring. However, the large man notices that his blow didn't connect with the girl, and, looking to the side, he manages to see the protagonist. The protagonist, who was holding the girl, tells him that she has the rope, and now it depends on him. Literally, the protagonist plans to fight him, and after he knocks him out of the ring, the protagonist tells him not to worry, since he will return his initial capital, even if he has to die. When the protagonist gets back into the ring, upon hearing the bell, he quickly launches himself towards the protagonist. However, what he wasn't expecting was that the protagonist would dodge each of his attacks, which makes him say that he can't believe the protagonist is doing this, avoiding, or rather, dodging, but the protagonist, launching himself against him, tells him that not only can he avoid the attacks, but he can also hit him. However, the moment the protagonist hits him, he notices how his arm bounces back, which makes him think, or rather, makes him wonder, if he is even human, since his muscles are as hard as steel, and it feels like he hit a steel plate. And while the protagonist was dodging all the big guy's attacks, the people who were there were wondering if that person's speed wasn't perhaps too much. The bodyguard tells the protagonist to get out of the way. However, when the protagonist tried to move her out of the way, she simply grabbed him, fast. While others said that fatigue could also exhaust the bombano to death, the big guy corners the protagonist, who was alone. Dodging him, he taunts him, telling him not to run if he dares, since he was supposed to receive a punch from him. The blonde-haired man, upon noticing this, ends up stopping the fight. It will seem to the protagonist that he cannot run and must sit face to face, or otherwise, he will lose immediately. But the bodyguard before this tells him that there is no such thing in the rules, that it is cheating, which causes Ed to tell him that this is his place and he makes the rules. Rules, and he can change them whenever he wants, and if he doesn't like it, then he had to hit him. However, the protagonist, in order to stop them from continuing to argue, says that it doesn't matter, since he will follow his rule, which surprises her. Well, they surprise the same ones, those who were telling the protagonist to take care of himself. The moment the fight restarts, he immediately lunges at the protagonist, who perhaps thought things were becoming challenging. He decides to play a card and, with its help, quickly manages to defeat him with a powerful punch to the jaw, thus achieving victory, or rather, achieving that, sending him flying through the air. And if you're wondering where the protagonist obtained that mysterious card, well, he received other things in his last contract, besides the ones already mentioned, but they aren't very relevant and weren't clearly explained. The card that the protagonist used is called the Fist of God. She grabbed his arm and threw him, but he didn't realize he threw him right toward his boss, the assassin, who was waiting. The blonde-haired man, frightened by this, wonders what the hell that punch was, while Yelan happily tells the protagonist that he has won the Kirin Group's first jackpot of 80 billion for their comeback, but his smile falters when he sees Miss May is very close to the protagonist. However, that wasn't what shocked him, but rather that Miss May kissed the protagonist on the cheek, and here, it shows us that the protagonist gained 50 intimacy points, and when this happens, we can see how truly sad Miss Yelan was. However, they are stopped by the yellow-haired man, who tells him that he won't let him leave with his money, saying, "So, do you naively believe that he will really let you take the 80 billion? Faced with this, the protagonist asks him if he thinks that he doesn't have the ability to take the 80C money, to which the red-haired man replies by asking, what if he times fight? Even if he could defeat 3 or 5 of them, could he possibly defeat times all times of his fighters? Professionals, or rather, his 20 professional fighters, to which the protagonist, while preparing to dish out some beatdowns, said, or rather, he wondered how he would know if he didn't try, and as you can imagine, these fighters were no match for the protagonist, who ended up beating each and every one of them to a pulp, or well, most of them, which leaves them dumbfounded at the protagonist's strength, the red-haired guy, who, the perfect moment to shoot. However, when he fired, he ended up hitting the protagonist, and while the bodyguard couldn't believe it, exclaimed how it was possible that the protagonist, being from a rich, ignorant, and incompetent second generation, could possess such impressive kung fu. To have such strong kung fu. The protagonist, approaching him, told him that he is willing to bet, but not willing to lose. You better behave and get out of his way, and don't let him use you to clear a path for himself. But he keeps insisting that they should return his money, with the protagonist telling him that he can't explain the loss of 880,000 million and can't just leave like that, or well, as if nothing happened. But the protagonist, lashing out at him, says that he won the money, so he can leave if he wants to. However, when the protagonist was about to hit him, he ends up, because the Black Star appears, the Black Star, who, pointing at the protagonist, tells him that this time he won't let him escape, and the protagonist, seeing, who was surrounded by many people pointing at him, ends up releasing the boy, saying, "So there's no way to avoid this now." And folks, here's a detail. What I found very curious is that the protagonist's pendant, which used to be blue, is now purple. However, we then see someone pointing at Black Star, who ends up getting shot by someone, and the person who shot Black Star was the blue-haired girl, who thinks to herself that she considers the protagonist a reward for saving her life. The protagonist, seizing the opportunity, tells Miss May. Wondering what was happening, the assassin simply says that she killed the wrong person again. That implies she has already tried it, that this is a good opportunity to counterattack, and then we see how the girl and the protagonist ended up defeating the assassins one by one. In the end, the protagonist even takes the weapon from one of them, leading the girl to ask him if he knows how to use a gun. Brutal responds that he is a young master, asking him what he times doesn't times know how to do, or rather, what he times hasn't times done, and then the protagonist twists the knife. Black Star quickly begs the protagonist to forgive him. However, the protagonist, looking at him coldly, tells him that he has beaten him so many times, asking how he could possibly have foreseen him that day, to which the assassin, realizing that the protagonist intended to eliminate him, says that he has a secret that could change his life, and since the protagonist is interested, he tells him he's listening, which leads the assassin, while he saw how the red-haired man wanted to escape, and he quickly tells the protagonist that the USB drive is the proof, saying, "So the person who The one who killed his father is Yaowai, and it was none other than the father of Liao Yuan and Cheng, or rather, Wei Jingge. The latter, frightened and looking at the murderer, asks him why he is directly avenging. The protagonist, upon hearing those words, becomes quite enraged, and mentioning Liao Yuan's name, tells him that he will destroy him. And so, the protagonist ends up delivering a tremendous blow, or rather, a fatal blow to the chest, which sends him flying. Little about himself, saying his name is Zhao Lin, and just half a month ago, he was the #1 man in AN. But unfortunately, at this moment, he not only has a debt, several times, and while the president begged the protagonist to wake up, saying he had saved her life and couldn't die, the protagonist wondered to himself, through the air, crashing against the wall. But that wasn't all, because, grabbing him, he tells him that the hatred for killing his father is irreconcilable, and, for which reason he will let him die. However, since the man doesn't want to die, he tells the protagonist that he'll tell him everything he knows. Well, he says he'll tell him everything, but to not kill him, and the protagonist, dragging him along, tells him that he has to tell him everything he knows. However, as the man was getting up, he apologizes to Leon for betraying him, but Leon says that he was also following orders. However, we then see a gun pointed at his head, held by Pele Azul, who tells him that he has betrayed his accomplice once again, and therefore, she mercilessly ends up eliminating him, and as he left, he thought that he would use his account number to send a message to G-Man Lee, a message that would tell him to stop eliminating him, and as he was leaving, he thought that he hoped to use his account number to send a message to G-Man Lee, a message that would tell him to stop embarrassing Zhao Lin, stop looking for her, or that will be the end of you. We then go to the protagonist's house, where we see him taking photos of the yellow hair and sending them to Lian. He asks if Lian has seen the photos, saying, so Lia Yan has told him the whole truth, and therefore, he has to pay for it. Moving on to Li Jin, who, let me emphasize, is the father of the yellow-haired guy. He tells the protagonist that he can satisfy all of his demands as long as he does nothing to his son. In response, the protagonist tells him that he wants to call a press conference. What's going on? It looks like he's been shot, and as his consciousness fades, the strength in his entire body seems to be giving out. Tomorrow, to make all of his crimes public and tell everyone the truth, something Li Jin has no choice but to accept. And here, we are told that this is the Galaxy Group president Li Jinhe, wasting no time, immediately instructs one of his employees to inform the media that, tomorrow, he will hold a press conference. Switching to the protagonist, we see him locking up the blonde-haired man, telling him that he only had to stay there, because when his father surrenders tomorrow, he will let him go. This happens, as the boy begs him not to leave him alone, because he is afraid of the dark. After several minutes, we see the blue-haired girl telling the protagonist that she made bone broth, and asking him if he would like some. It's worth noting that the young lady was wearing an elegant suit. The protagonist ends up accepting the broth, and as he drank it, he thanked her. But then he noticed something, and quickly asked what was going on with the pottery that was originally placed there. She replies that it is full of broth, and she used it to boil the bones, which is what he just drank, which almost gave the protagonist a heart attack, since those were his father's ashes. He thinks to himself, so, I was a miserable son. To which, woman, smiling and approaching the protagonist, tells him it's a joke, and that she enshrined him in the Buddhist hall next door. After a while, the problems, quickly, his eyelids growing heavy, wondering if this is what dying feels like, as he can clearly feel himself. Protagonist, now standing in front of his father's ashes, tells him that he knows that old fox, Lin, won't be caught without a fight, and that he is ready to fight him to the death, saying that if he is with the Great Spirit, he had to bless it as a flag of victory. Taking a dagger, he tells his father that he must first lend him that family heirloom. The next day, the protagonist, who was prepared to go to the press conference, finishes, being stopped by the blue-haired girl, who tells him, well, she asks him if he is going out, and that, if so, he has to wait a moment. Approaching him, she tells him that she will fix his clothes. The protagonist, a little embarrassed, asks what about Jian-Yi, telling her that if he doesn't come back that day, he will move in half a year, so he should prepare in advance. But as the protagonist was leaving, the blue-haired girl tells him that, of course, he will wait for him to return for dinner, and while he's at the conference, we see the red-haired man's father tell everyone that he called that press conference specifically for that day, because he has to make a very important announcement. Miss Mail tells the protagonist that she has already called the police, And when Yi Jin announces the truth, in public, the police immediately arrest him, and the Kirin group can also begin a new chapter, which the protagonist mentions to Mail. That's what he's been waiting for. However, completely turning the situation around, he tells everyone that the protagonist, in fact, kidnapped his son, Lia Yuan, dying. However, as the protagonist is thinking this, we see his mother's pendant reacting, but it makes the protagonist think that he already knew that this man would do something like that. In other words, the protagonist was already expecting it. Nevertheless, this lady ends up approaching the protagonist to inform him that he overheard the recording of his conversation with Mr. Li yesterday and suspects he is connected, as it is important to the disappearance of Lia, or Yuan, that is, his son, and asks him to please return with them so they can investigate. And here we are told the name of this beautiful young lady, who is Luin Nan. The latter, believing that he has already won, tells the protagonist that he has already dispatched someone to rescue his son, and now, his son should also be out of danger, thus informing the protagonist that not even his father was a match for him, and questioning whether he still wants to continue. Well, he wants to rattle him, but the protagonist, with a serious demeanor, tells him that from the moment he lost everything, he never considered backing down, in one breath, telling him that he is a 2-meter tall man, and that if he cannot avenge his father's death, he will not be a man. This was while the Officer Luo told the protagonist that he should immediately take his hands out of his pockets and get down on his knees with his hands on his head, or, otherwise he would shoot. However, while the protagonist was taking something out, he declared that this was the day that Fish would die. However, he ends up being surprised when he realizes that he pulled out the USB drive and not his knife. Several minutes later, the protagonist took advantage of the fact that protagonist can't see it and just thinks how unlucky he is, since he owed 2 million yuan, and now he's lost his life. However, we are then shown he had the USB drive to show the officer how his father was tortured by the yellow-haired man's father, and after showing it to him, the protagonist tells the officer, Luo needs to figure out who the murderer is, the one whose actions have left him terrified, since he wasn't expecting something like this. This happened while the people present there, people murmured that the president of the Kirin group, Yaoi, was murdered by Li Jinhe himself. Seeing that he was being targeted, he tells Officer Luo that he will surrender, but asks that they don't kill him. But Luo, calculating everything, thinks that Li Jinhe is rich and has good connections, and even if he is caught, it's very difficult for him to be sentenced to death, and he can't let him go easily. Having said this, the protagonist ends up throwing himself into the situation. This was while telling him that he wants to avenge his father. However, along the way, the protagonist ends up tripping. However, this was actually the protagonist's plan, since the protagonist quickly ended up passing him a gun, thinking as he did so that he was lucky to have picked one up at the boxing gym. And even though it didn't, it has bullets, it's still a useful thing. Already on the ground, the protagonist tells Ginge not to kill him. However, we know that this is all part of the protagonist's plan. Officer, seeing that he had a gun, tells him to drop it, or she will shoot. However, he ends up being struck by a bullet, so the other policemen relentlessly attack him, riddling him with bullets. The officer, upon seeing this, says that she didn't give the order to shoot a large house, and upon seeing it, the protagonist thinks it's the goddess's sanctuary, wondering if it might be the vestibule of heaven, because it doesn't seem like, thus asking who shot first, but it seems that none of them fired the first shot. He, after receiving that barrage of gunfire, looking up, he asks the protagonist if he really thinks he's the only one capable of facing his Yao family, arguing that if the protagonist can't defeat him, he's sure to die. Having said this, he immediately loses his own life. Faced with this, the president argues to the protagonist that the first shot was fired from the building across the street, and sure enough, someone tried to kill someone, which makes the protagonist, who is a little annoyed, say that there were other secrets behind his father's death. However, when the protagonist tried to leave, he was stopped by Officer Luo, who said that his suspicion of him kidnapping Lia Yuan has not yet been cleared, and therefore he must conduct a search of his residence. He stated that his suspicion of him kidnapping Lia Yuan has not yet been cleared, and therefore he must carry out a search of his residence, and even so you can't lose sight of him. Time passes, and we shift to the protagonist's villa, where Officer Luo is listening to the security team explain how the security team told her that they hadn't found anything suspicious, but far from giving up, she touched the wall and insisted that most villas like this have dark rooms, and she needed to find a hidden passage. Nevertheless, the security team ends up finding something, and one of them quickly tells his companion to inform the captain, as a hidden camera has been discovered, and it seems someone is inside. Officer Luo, upon being informed of this, quickly grabs he has to go to hell, and while the protagonist was in the process of opening a large door, a status window suddenly appeared, informing the protagonist's hand to arrest him. However, we then see that the person inside the camera wasn't the red-haired man, but instead, the blue-haired girl. As if well handcuffed, Asamate told the protagonist that not everyone can wait, leading her to accuse the protagonist of playing games. With too many flowers, that is, with too many girls around him, because he also has the president, he has the bodyguard, and now the blue-haired girl, Officer Ante. Faced with this, Ante ends up retreating, and as she turned around, she told her team that they should withdraw. The protagonist told her that it's not what it seems. It is what it seems, since that's not actually the case, leading her to think that, even though he hasn't gone to prison, he has been sentenced to death, a social death. This is happening while the girl reminded him that he himself helped her again, asking, "So how can you thank him?" To which the protagonist, excitedly, says that she can thank him with her body, but she tells him that she only thinks of beautiful things. And moving on from that topic, the protagonist asks her where Liu Yan is, which she responds that she has moved him to the ground floor and that he is sealed away, so he won't be easy to find, something the protagonist appreciates, since it was very clever of her. Down on the ground floor, we can see the red-haired man lying lifeless, which causes the protagonist to ask her if she killed him, to which she, approaching the lifeless body, tells him that she wasn't the one who did. The goddess contract system has been activated and will begin linking to the host. After the goddess system has linked, a large window that, since the blood is still warm, and he must have been killed just before he came through the door, but the portal, she says, he noticed that the lock on the door was intact, making him wonder if there was perhaps a murderer hiding in a secret room. Because of this, he quickly launches an attack, telling the protagonist that the murderer is hiding there, and we can see how his attack is aimed directly at the ventilation duct. While inside the ventilation duct, the protagonist asks if he happens to have the ability to shrink his bones, and questions how he can run so fast in such a disgusting passage. But she tells the protagonist that this kind of method of murder, the secret room, must be the work of the gold medal assassin, Wen Chao. And if that's the case, they've definitely gotten into trouble. As she places her hand on him, on his shoulder, the protagonist asks him why he messed things up, saying that he had to go after the murderer while wounded, to which the protagonist replies, the same one who is tired tells him, while passing over him, that she will do it, but the protagonist refuses. He struggles, as he can't take it anymore. However, upon seeing the beautiful view, the protagonist ends up blushing, and while the girl was hitting the protagonist, she told him not to look, something the protagonist says was really not his intention. Later, we can see how she tells the status suddenly appears, stating that it is the goddess contract system, that the host is Jiaolin, and that the reward is divine speed, calculation, protagonist that she has already taken care of him and he doesn't have to worry about being discovered, which makes the protagonist question her, who the hell she was, and she needed to tell him right then, but she just tells the protagonist that he shouldn't ask because the less he knows, the better for him. But the protagonist insists that he needs to know, especially since Li Jinj was shot in the head right next to him, and he's afraid of being the next victim, afraid of not knowing who his opponent is until he dies. The assassin, upon hearing this, was silent for a moment before telling the protagonist that YG killed Y Jinj and Wen Chao killed Liao Yuan. And both of them come from the same organization, thereby telling him that the Aiden Society is the organization, and looking at him seriously, she tells him that the Aiden Society is more powerful than he can possibly imagine. Imagine words that surprised the protagonist, as he remembered his father mentioning them before, thus revealing that the Aiden Society tried to catch his father, but he refused, and to his surprise, that led to his death. At that same moment, we are transported to Aiden's club, and as we can see, several members are gathered in the club, of which Yuan is the president. The Yosin group tells Manle to tell them about the current situation, which he then recounts. He tells them that the parents and children have been eliminated, and the video only shows Jinj committing the crime, so they could sit and divine calculation, and an identity value increase of 1. His mission is to contract with Yelan. That is mission number 1. And mission number 2 is to contract with Meek Angela, and relax. The one in the green jacket argues that Join isn't dead yet, and that is a ticking time bomb. This guy was Gao Jin, the president of the group. Gao, this fat guy, asked what was so difficult, wondering if they shouldn't just kill him. This chubby guy is Huan Yao, president of the Asian Chamber of Commerce, and this beautiful young lady is Suing Yue, president of An Bank, who pointed out that Zhaolin still owes them a significant amount of money, wondering if killing him now would be all for naught, since perhaps they could recover the remaining money if they let him live. Gao, in response, tells everyone that the Kirin Group owes the Galaxy Group 180 billion and owes him 200 billion, then asks how much they are owed, to which the chubby guy responds that he is owed 300 billion, while the one with glasses stated that he is also owed 300 billion. Faced with this, the girl, he tells everyone that he is owed 100 billion. Yes, the protagonist's father was heavily in debt. Given this situation, Gao reiterates to everyone that, so much money. Even if they sold the protagonist, they wouldn't be able to pay it off. And instead of wasting time with the protagonist, why not just get rid of him, saying that otherwise, the protagonist will drag them all down one by one, just like he did with Yi Jinhei, which prompts Yuch Chan to say that, since everyone's opinions are divided, the old rule applies. A vote by show of hands, saying, so, everyone in favor of eliminating the, of 2 billion yen. But he's also facing the threat of prison. Half a month ago, his father died suddenly, leaving him in astronomical debt. Rewards are shared by both parties of the contract, and identity value can be exchanged for lifespan. When the protagonist looks at the protagonist should raise their hand, which everyone, absolutely everyone, ends up doing, and since everyone had voted in favor of eliminating, the protagonist, the one with glasses, tells Janet that Manly's side has lost a lot of people recently and that the police are on high alert again, and therefore he must take care of the protagonist, to which the protagonist, with an evil smile, replies that there is no problem, guaranteeing that he will do the job well. Moving on with the... As for the protagonist, Miss May was asking him when they would get a car. If he really can't buy it, she can buy one herself. Motorcycle, since riding a bicycle to and from work every day will make him lose his image as president. Well, president of a publicly traded company. The protagonist, who looked quite happy sitting behind him, tells him that after the verdict was issued, he did not. They have to pay the 180 billion that they owed to Galaxy Grow, or rather, the Galaxy Group, but the remaining 1.82 trillion won't get them much further. They plan to buy a car once they finish paying it off. Changing the subject slightly, Miss Mayil tells the protagonist that her sister is having surgery that day, and she wants to leave work early to go to the hospital, which the protagonist is fine with, especially since she mentions that she doesn't have anything to do that day anyway, so he'll accompany her. However, after they arrive at the hospital, we see the doctor informing Miss May that the patient couldn't be. Large system window. He just thinks it looks like he's logged in, but not really, since he only has 1 hour left to live, and then he's moved to a resuscitated and was declared dead, which completely devastated her. She asks the doctor how it happened, since the patient was fine when he left, after the doctor told him what doctors always say, that they did their best and apologized. But we know that a simple apology, he won't bring his sister back. The protagonist, who was watching everything unfold, didn't dare utter a single word, but in his mind, he called out to the system to ask if there was any way to save these people, as he couldn't bear to see women in such a state. In response, the system informs him that he has successfully redeemed the Great Elixir, and because it was his first purchase, a discount of 60 intimacy points was applied, leaving him with 0 intimacy points remaining, which shocks the protagonist, since he only contacted the system to inquire and never actually told it that he was going to make a motion. Thinking this way, he now has less than a day to live. Yes, literally the system deceived the protagonist, and the protagonist, as he already self-to any meltus. He can't do anything about it, so he ends up accepting it, saying, so, I was going to save lives. Approaching Miss May, he tells her not to cry, since he can save her sister. Given this, the doctor asks the protagonist if he is questioning her professionalism, thus telling the protagonist, who did everything she could to rescue her, but her heartbeat stopped, and her brainwaves disappeared, and she is now a person. Hospital. They said he had clearly been pierced through the heart, so why is he still alive? It's a medical miracle. The protagonist, who have absolutely dead. The protagonist, having an ace up his sleeve, tells her that he will then create a medical miracle for her, which leads the doctor to tell the protagonist that medical miracles do exist in this world, but there is no medical miracle that can resurrect the dead, which the protagonist replies that it's because she hasn't met him before. However, just as the protagonist puts the pill in his mouth, the lifeless body, that he exchanged with the system, and he wondered why there was no response, to which the doctor says, well, she asks him if he dares to waste time, to which the protagonist, a little doubtful, tells her that he just needs to wait a little longer for the medicine to take effect, but she says to please leave immediately, or she will call security. However, at that moment, the girl who was presumed dead ended up asking why they were making so much noise erupts, surprising everyone, even the protagonist, since he wasn't expecting times that asterisk. Well, to clarify, yes, the protagonist expected something, but not to this extent. We continue. The doctor, astonished by what she had just witnessed with her own eyes, asks the protagonist if he truly came back to life, just as he claimed. She questions the protagonist, asking who the hell he is and how he managed to do it, to which the protagonist replies that it's a technique that's always in style. But this is understandable, since the protagonist can't reveal that the system provided him with that pill. However, something very important that we cannot. Found himself in one of these rooms, ends up waking up. The president, upon seeing him, her eyes filled with joy, is quite happy since the protagonist isn't dead. What we can't forget is that the protagonist exchanged his intimacy points for the pill, and thanks to that exchange, he now only has half an hour, a few precious minutes, left to live. Afterward, the protagonist, who was sitting down, was thinking, or rather wondering to himself, when Miss May would finish the checkup, his sister, because he needs to add something of intimate value to her in order to regain some life. However, his thoughts are interrupted by a person whose personality resembles the protagonist's, reporting that the patient in bed 19 not only had all his injuries disappear, but all his vital signs return to normal. And the person saying this was the doctor, who continued telling the protagonist that he shattered her worldview, asking him, himself, what kind of pill he gave the patient, even asking if she could take one to investigate it, but the protagonist, with a serious look, told her. He asks her what kind of tutor could have instilled in her the habit of chasing money, to which the doctor responds to the protagonist that, of course, he knows that her medicine is precious and that he can pay for it, but the protagonist says that if only money could buy it all while thinking that he bought it with his own life, but since the doctor does want the medicine to investigate it, the protagonist tells her that he will give her whatever she wants, that she only has to ask, since everything is negotiable. All this, while we could see how the system tells the protagonist, or rather, warns him. Girl tells the protagonist that he had scared her half to death, and she will remember him for the rest of her life for saving her. The protagonist, surprised, that it detected a new contract target. However, she shelters the protagonist, doesn't say anything to him, shows him some papers, and tells him that when he was in college when he founded a pharmaceutical and cosmetic company with numerous patented formulas, and it now has a market value of 20 million, saying that it's not enough, but it's all he has, and he really needs that pill. As the doctor tells this to the protagonist, we see how the system displays its statistics to him. However, the most important thing of all is that if the protagonist succeeds in making a contract with that goddess, they will be granted a bonus of 10 days of life. However, we can see that the protagonist only has 10 days of life remaining. Actually, he only has 10 seconds of life remaining. And the protagonist, faced with this situation, and wearing a big smile, thought that the mountains are returning, and everything is going back to normal. Standing up, he tells the doctor that the contract can be signed, but with one additional condition, that he must remain the chief engineer, that pharmaceutical company, which she agrees to, but the protagonist quickly hands her the contract and tells her to sign it. Quickly, since, as we could see, the protagonist only had 8 seconds to live, and when the protagonist had only 1 second left of life, the doctor finally signs the contract, at which point the system promptly informs the protagonist that he now has 10 days to live. By what is happening, thinks that he is literally dead right now, except that the system had given him an hour to live, and during that period, something that makes the protagonist very happy, he takes the doctor's hand and tells her that he feels good now that he's fully charged. Well, I don't know. What that will mean remains to be seen, but let's continue. And while the doctor was thinking the protagonist was disgusting for touching her hand, she informs him that the contract is signed, telling him, so you can give him the pills. The protagonist replies that he hasn't investigated that pharmaceutical company yet, and it's still unclear if it's worth 20 million. This is while he was thinking he almost forgot, since he doesn't have enough intimacy points to buy the Grand Elisil, so he has to delay the purchase, which seems to affect the doctor in some way. The protagonist then gives her the address of the company, and since they are scheduled to meet at the company tomorrow, he reminds her to bring the medicine, the medication. Following this, while the two were returning, the girl thanked the protagonist for greeting her sister, saying that he was a great person, but the protagonist was only thinking, what? It's a shame that good people don't live long. However, at that moment, Miss May noticed some thugs who were pointing and telling their people that it was them. They were telling their people that it was them, to which Miss May, while cracking her knuckles, told the protagonist that she would go first, and if she couldn't stop them, then he himself should escape. However, the protagonist, while running, told her to run away, asking her if she didn't see that. He manages to make a contract with the goddess, which will extend his life. However, if the contract fails, the life he was just granted will disappear, and therefore, the protagonist. The others on the other side had knives, and even if he could defeat them, he would end up with many cuts, so what was the point? And the girl, seeing this, upon hearing this, they remarked on the protagonist's intelligence, and while they were running, Miss May informed the protagonist that Loyan was dead. Why they were still pursuing him, to which the protagonist replied that they must have been sent by the Aiden Society. After several seconds, the protagonist and the girl eventually reached these buildings. Faced with this situation, the protagonist told her that he should go up first, and while the protagonist, as he lifted the girl, she asked what about him, to which the protagonist responded that he would follow behind her. However, as she climbed, we could see more thugs following her, saying that the protagonist and the girl were up there and needed to leave. Behind them, however, we could see the protagonist, while grabbing onto a pipe, plotting something, and he hadn't even climbed up yet. With the girl there, he seized the opportunity to take them all down, and when I say he took everyone down, I mean absolutely everyone, even the girl, who, as she fell, told the protagonist he was a fool. However, the protagonist, positioning himself beneath her, told her not to be afraid because he was about to make his best move, and he did, as the protagonist caught her with an agile maneuver. While explaining the contract to the president, he tells her that he would like to invite her to change jobs and become the president of the Kirin group, which she found incredible, but the protagonist tells her that it's time for her to lose some weight, which makes the girl, while tugging on his cheek. I asked the protagonist what he had said, and this turned out to be a good thing, since the protagonist gained 100 intimacy points, which makes the protagonist, while leaving with the girl hand in hand, wonders if so much intimacy is really worth it, thinking that perhaps it got mixed up with the intimacy from when he saved his sister. However, we can see someone observing everything from inside this car. This someone was the one in the green jacket, who, angrily, said that they were a bunch of idiots, since with so many people they couldn't handle the protagonist, which leads him to say to the same person that it seems that the protagonist's life is not destined to end like this, and that they should give him some time, adding that they can earn money by asking, why should they take his life? This prompts the green-jacketed man to respond to the president, stating that she is part of the fight against the group. Kirin tells him that if they just sit and watch the protagonist rise in power, neither of them will fare well, implying that the protagonist, he was lucky that time, and therefore, he himself should enjoy the last few days of life he has left. Time passes, and we transition to the hospital, and, in that hospital, the doctor was explaining to the protagonist that the R&D department, I don't know what that means, is on the left, and on the Kirin, and he knows it's difficult for her, but only she can save him. Faced with this, the president tells the protagonist that even though the Kirin group, right, is the sales department, then, showing something to the protagonist, she says that it's the new Yan whitening product that he has unlocked. Condensed from his family's ancient recipes, he believes that once it is officially listed, it will bring him hundreds of millions in profits, which the protagonist finds unbelievable. The doctor continues to tell him that, according to ancient records, Yinan has miraculous effects, but before she can finish, they are interrupted by these thugs, who obviously force their way in. The thug tells Miss B that she has deceived him, and therefore he will destroy her rundown store. But since the doctor doesn't know what he's talking about, she approaches him and asks what is happening. The thug responds by saying how dare she brazenly hurt her, and showing her face, tells the doctor that the day before, she used her. Yinan looks like this today, and not only is his face rotting, but he even stinks. Because of this, the doctor tells him that something is really wrong, but he definitely assures her that he doesn't stink, since she doesn't smell anything, words that anger her, and she launches herself towards the doctor, asking if she wants to die. However, before the bat hits the doctor, the protagonist intervenes, blocking the bat, and, asks what the problem is. Seeing that the protagonist was helping her, the doctor thanked him for coming to her aid, faces bankruptcy, and is deeply in debt. There is still room for maneuvering, and furthermore, her physical condition hasn't been but she really doesn't want him to get involved, telling the protagonist that he hid the instability of her medicine, but she doesn't want it like that anymore. He is free to leave, which prompts the protagonist to tell him that if he leaves now, he will become the subject of gossip, asking him if she is mistaken in what she says, and she corrects the protagonist, explaining that the doctor will not only be gossiped about, but her face will be ruined. The protagonist tells her that there is no need for that, as he can help her heal, but seeing that the doctor is not very convinced, he tells her that he can restore her face to its original condition in just 3 hours, which causes her to remain silent for a few seconds, but turning around, she tells the protagonist that 3 hours is too long and she will only give him half an hour, saying, "So, if you don't help her, this place will be completely destroyed." And looking at him, he coldly tells the protagonist that he will ensure they both leave there dead. Faced with this, the doctor tells the protagonist that he cannot leave now, even if she wants to, saying, "So she really deserves it, since unstable products couldn't, or well, shouldn't be tested on customers." But the protagonist, while looking at the bottle, told her that they should only stabilize those products. However, she tells the protagonist that she has tried thousands of mixtures, but the ingredients are so mixed that the final balance cannot be achieved. She tells the protagonist that, since he has tried so much, "Oh my God, I can't." With the Kirin group, and thanks to that, he went from heaven to hell overnight, truly experiencing what it means to be good lately, and she has been preparing to resign and rest for a while. But since the protagonist is the one asking, she can consider it, or rather, say this, but you're reading it. Since he has tested so much of it, he has now almost completely lost his sense of smell, which makes the protagonist tell her that it's not surprising that she didn't recognize the stony scent on Elfie's face earlier, Elfie being the girl's name from before, and asks the doctor about it. He asks if she wants to restore and improve her sense of smell, to which she replies that of course she does, and then the protagonist, while pulling out a card, says to her that she has a secret that can help her with that, and all she has to do is put it on her face, all while thinking that the sense of smell of bears is 2,000 times better than that of humans, and that's enough to complete his fortune. And after the protagonist places the card on her face, she is quite surprised because her nose has returned, and she can distinguish smells again. Having said this, the protagonist tells her to give up. Pris sets up the recipe correctly because she doesn't have much time left, which she ultimately accepts, but while using her sense of smell, he wondered if that was what a man smelled like, saying, "So I didn't expect him to smell so good," referring to the protagonist. All the while, we could see 10 intimacy points being added. The protagonist, noticing that the doctor was a little distracted, asks her if maybe they could start, as he was thinking that this doctor would indeed be useful to him, since the system gave her a score of 10, or rather, added 10. There is still hope for the protagonist, to which the protagonist, with that expression, tells him not to even bother thinking about it for more than an hour. Points just for being near her, and while the doctor was preparing everything, she was thinking about problems that couldn't be solved with her effort. This is now child's play. Half an hour later, we see Urfi finally enter, telling the protagonist and the girl that their time is up, asking if they have already decided how they will die, but the doctor approaches and tells him that they are finished, informing Miss Urfi that, trust her, as she will not make another mistake, and telling her that if she is truly wrong, she is willing to accept the consequences, to which Urfi, without saying anything, proceeds to take the bottle and then throws it in his face. The protagonist, seeing this, tells her that she was too trusting, asking if she isn't afraid that something worse will happen. But she tells the protagonist that her face is destroyed, and what else does she have to risk? Telling him that if something goes wrong, anyway, AL has it and she can bury them with it. Hey, dear viewers, welcome to a new installment of this wonderful manga. Family, I know very well that I took a while to bring you the continuation of this manga, but let me explain the reason. It's because this manga is still missing many chapters, that is, they are still releasing chapters. And if they continue releasing chapters, believe me, I will bring you more videos for the channel. But of course, it will take a little more time to bring you the video. But anyway, folks, without further ado, leave your like, and let's continue where we left off. After an hour he doesn't need to think about it, because literally, after an hour the protagonist would be done for. However, at that moment, Elfie threw the vial over her face. We could observe how she was apparently suffering, since she even tells us that it burned quite a bit. However, at the end, the protagonist and the doctor realize just how beautiful she is, so much so that the protagonist admits he hadn't noticed it before. It was Erfi, the doctor. Because of this, he was overjoyed, as his medicine had finally worked, and while the doctor was thanking the protagonist, we can see his intimacy stat increasing even further, reaching a total of 20, which causes the protagonist to cry tears of joy, since he can finally redeem it with those intimacy points, especially since even after redeeming the Great Elixir, there should be plenty remaining. However, the system throws another curveball at the protagonist, informing him that it detects his desire to redeem the elixir, and the Kangel will be initiated, and when the Kangel is successful, the system informs the protagonist that the intimacy value consumed is 2. Now he only has 1 intimacy value remaining, which causes the protagonist to curse the system, since no one told him that he had to purchase it separately. The protagonist then tells the system that, furthermore, it only cost 60 intimacy points last time, and asks why the price has increased. This time, the system answers the protagonist's question, explaining that the previous time was the discounted price for the first purchase, but this time, ends up shouting the protagonist's name, telling him that he shouldn't resist, since he just has to wait until he can't return the. Maybe this time it is the normal price, according to the system's explanations. Returning to the girls, she asks the doctor if her medicine is so. Well, why doesn't she enter a medical beauty pageant? The doctor asks if she's talking about the National Medical Beauty Pageant, and if, that's right, of course she wanted that great opportunity for advancement, but she signed up and was immediately rejected. However, he's handing her a card, VIP card, to the doctor, and tells her that if she uses that card to register, no one will reject her again. However, the protagonist recognizes the letter that the CEO was giving the doctor, since the protagonist knows very well that the letter is a Black Dragon card, and that card symbolizes that you are a member of the dragon's main family, which is an incredible thing, since there are no more than 10 inches the entire city of Aichen, and their usefulness goes far beyond. The imagination of ordinary people leads them to think they heard long ago that there's a sister in the dragon family, which is why the protagonist wonders if, maybe it's her. However, the protagonist's thoughts are interrupted by the doctor, who is wondering what the card is for, since the Aesthetic Medical Association is of a very high level. However, the protagonist, taking the card from her hand, tells her that he has to check it to see if it works, which makes the doctor ask him if that's appropriate, to which the protagonist answers money and goes to jail, telling him that he can't ruin the legacy of his galaxy group. And if you're wondering who this is, it's Liu Yan, the eldest son of the that of course the competition is important, which is why he asks her why not fight for it. She, now convinced, the protagonist, holding a jar, says that the product inside is complete, and she will take it with her. Time passes, and the scene shifts to this building. And in the registry office, a young lady was telling Director Yuk that she was there for a review, asking if he could assist her, to which the director tells him not to worry, because with his connection to Mr. Gao, the championship will definitely be his, and no one else should even consider it. And here, they take the opportunity to tell us this guy's full name, which is Hayu, the director of the Medical Beauty Association. Eventually, the doctor and the protagonist arrive at the place. The doctor arrived with the protagonist, and they told Director Yuk that they were there to register. However, he turned his gaze towards the doctor and told her. He asks her if that isn't his former student, and this woman here tells us that she is Joa, the president of Tina Medicina. Well, there she is. The Englishman, very arrogantly, asks the doctor, how dare her small, insignificant company even sign up? And here the doctor takes the opportunity to tell the protagonist that Joa is her friend from university, but the protagonist tells her that it doesn't seem like her friend is be very friendly, to which the doctor replies that she doesn't know why he keeps singling her out. Nevertheless, the director ends up asking the doctor, Galaxy Group. He tells the protagonist that Yelan, that is, the president, is his, and he'd better stay away from her, to figure out who she is now, and accept it. If her company is called Medical Biot, which she confirms, telling him that it is the same company as before, expelled the shady practices, or rather, the shady practices within the medical beauty industry. The director, upon hearing these words, immediately tells the doctor that they are not members of the association and therefore cannot register. However, the doctor points out that the contest rules stipulate that one can participate even if they are not members of the association, and therefore asks him to please be generous, adding that their products are absolutely groundbreaking and the clinical data is available for review. However, he ignores her words and, throwing the papers at the doctor, says that if he said they're not in, so she shouldn't waste any more of his time, which clearly leaves the doctor surprised. However, the humiliation doesn't end there. Chon-na, stepping on the documents, tells her that she didn't think she would lower herself so much, especially considering the doctor in front of her. Faced with this, he tells her that it is his heart and soul and, therefore, she shouldn't trample on it, even if she doesn't want it. The protagonist, in response, he tells Miss Chon to apologize to the doctor immediately and, showing her the black dragon card, demands that she apologize to her immediately. But the latter, enraged, ends up throwing the card to the floor at the protagonist's feet, while asking if he is making a fool of him. His defeat leads the protagonist to question how it's possible, but the blonde simply tells the protagonist that he doesn't stand a chance. Her hair, telling the protagonist to repeat what he said, as she will never participate in a medical beauty contest in her life, telling the protagonist, let him leave immediately. The protagonist, shocked, asks him how he dares to throw away the dragon black card, but the 12 director tells him not to act so important in front of him, as he's never even heard of it. Looking at the doctor, he tells her that he only needed to see what kind of person she'd found, telling her that the protagonist is simply a suitor of low standing. The doctor, faced with this, and not wanting to endure any more humiliation, asks the protagonist why they don't just leave, but the protagonist simply tells her not to be in a hurry, as he will take care of everything. Therefore, pointing at Director J, he tells him that he wants to see his president right now. He thought he was the #1 young master and still doesn't know the power of that card. At that moment, in order to release the protagonist, someone ends up asking, "What? Who's looking for him?" And that someone is K-Min, president of the medical association. Joe Albert, who is the president, tells him that it's a minor matter, since Counselor Jude denied entry to a small company because their product was too inferior, and now they are causing trouble, which makes the president ask what company it is, telling him to blacklist the company. However, upon seeing the card on the ground, the president immediately, against him, and kneeling before him, the president proposes marriage, saying that in the future she will be the wife of the president of the Galaxy Group and will never, ends up picking it up since he recognized it as the card, well, the Black Dragon card. The director, seeing that the president picked up the card, tells the protagonist took it out to show off his power, but then he threw it away, saying, "So I threw it away," which prompts the president to ask him if he really threw it away. When Director Yu confirms that he did, the president slaps him hard across the face, calling him a stupid bastard, and asking if he wants to die. This leaves Yu confused, wondering what's happening. Director Yu asks the president what could be wrong, since it's just an ordinary card. However, the president unleashes a flurry of blows, asking if he's tired of living and how he dares to call the Black Dragon card common. Passing the card to the protagonist, he apologizes profusely for his carelessness on the job and tells him that he is now eligible to participate. It's a direct entry and registration isn't necessary, but the protagonist, after taking the card, asks the president if his association truly has no rules, to which the president replies that it does, and therefore offers a million apologies. Dr. Honest thought that the protagonist possessed a dominant presence, like a natural aura of nobility. All this, while Miss Chon wondered exactly what the have to resign. Or well, I don't know what that means, but the president tells him to get up, saying that she wasn't going to say yes, since they are not meant for. Status of that person was, that is, our protagonist, and how he could make President Q act so respectfully, even to the point that it seems the president is afraid because of what happened, pointing at the director and declaring that his position as advisor is terminated. So he had to leave immediately, which leads him to tearfully tell the president that he has a family, a father and son to support, and he can't lose this job. But the president simply continued telling the protagonist to ignore him and that they needed to go inside immediately. Hearing these words, Director Yu tells him that Director Yu says that they have a president who supports him, so there's nothing they can do, which prompts Director Yu to tell Miss Jo that he lost his job because of her, telling her that she can't abandon him, to which the young lady responds to Director Yu that he shouldn't worry and he mustn't forget that her boyfriend is Ri Takami. Apparently, this person is important, and as he leaves, he says the doctor was lucky this time, but he will participate. She is definitely going to win that contest, and while she's at the testing station, the doctor tells the person she was using as a test subject that she could now wash her face, which makes her ask the doctor if it can work that quickly. And as she gets up, she tells the doctor that surely her products are a scam, but the doctor seems very confident in herself as she tells the girl to believe in her, which the girl, each other, to which he, dejected by the response, asks the president if she really wants to end the group, which makes the president ask him. Getting up, she comments that she was unlucky not to have been chosen for the experiment. Well, I'm not going to say that because that thing is in English. However, someone ended up telling the doctor that it hasn't even been 5 minutes since they started, and she's already saying it's over, which is. Someone is clearly Joe Nan, who asks him if he admitted defeat because he knew he was too weak, and then says, "So your small business is not qualified to compete there, much less to participate in the competition." However, at that moment, she ends up noticing a commotion the girls were causing, as they were shouting at the top of their lungs that everyone just had to look at his face, something that would impress the crowd. Doctor, it was that the girl he used for the test came to thank him, apologizing for what she had said before, and said something like this. She is very sorry, and looking at her intently, the doctor tells her that her products are simply divine, and yes, the scandal that the girls caused was because of her face, since the doctor's products seemed to be working perfectly. Johal, seeing this, was shocked and wondered how all of that had happened. Several minutes later, one of the people in charge of the round announced that, after 3 rigorous rounds of selection, the 2 finalists are, number 1, Tina Medicinal Butte, number 2, Ma Medicinal Butte. Yeah, I barely understand this myself, so don't blame me, okay? The doctor, faced with this, indifferent to the world, the protagonist then receives a call from his girlfriend, which he answers with great happiness. How he means ending it. However, at that moment, the president ends up feeling a little dizzy and ends up falling into the arms of her bodyguard. Happily approaching the protagonist, tells him that they have finally made progress with their product, to which the protagonist responds that, that's right, saying to him, so, if your product is a success today, Ye Jan's name will be known worldwide. However, someone unexpectedly announces that Ye Jan's products are officially locked down, and no one is allowed to touch them until the finals begin. Authorization to access them will start now. As everyone was leaving, Choi told the doctor that there was no way she could win. Yes, she's very confident in herself, but well, we'll see what happens. Later, she was extremely angry, wondering how the doctor was able to create such an amazing product. Even so, she said that even if the doctor's product is very good, hers will be a stepping stone to success, so there shouldn't be a problem. However, someone ends up. Ask Chen, who made her so angry. And we're introduced to the person responsible. The one in the green jacket, who Cha is quite happy to see. He's holding on tight. The one in the green jacket tells him that they are the same, Jiaolin and Bei's pair of dogs, and that it seems they got their hands on the new one, recipe from somewhere, and tried to steal the championship from him, which prompts the girl to ask about Jiaolin. Upon hearing him mention the protagonist's name, she asks if he knows him, to which the one in the green jacket responds that the protagonist used to be Chen's #1 son. She asks Yelan if she has another headache, to which Yelan replies that the pain has been occurring more and more often, one of Chen's, but now he's just a dog. Well, he's a simple dog, which makes her remark that it's no wonder the doctor is so arrogant, since it seems that she has found a sponsor. However, a featherless phoenix is no better than a chicken, and therefore, the doctor will never achieve her goals in life. Approaching the man in the green jacket, she tells him that he has to help her get the title because internal sources have informed her that the winning product has already been reserved by high-level individuals from all over the world, with a minimum business volume of $1 billion to start. With that said, it seems the man in the green jacket will help the girl, because, looking at Director Yu, he tells him that it depends on Mr. Yu's willingness, to which Mr. Yu replies that, as long as he can help them, he will do whatever it takes. Upon hearing this, smiling, he repeats the same words, acknowledging what he has to do. Several hours later, the National Medical Beauty Grand Finale officially begins. For this stage, the participants are invited to choose their experiment subjects, who include a girl with a wrinkle and another with a disfigurement. Faced with this choice, he ends up selecting the person with the disfigurement, leading the protagonist to believe that Cha's product was wasted on him. Works better, get rid of her. Still, why did he choose the disfigured volunteer? Thinking this way, it seems there is something hidden, but regardless, that gives him a. Recently, many things have felt so confusing. Nevertheless, the blonde man ends up dropping the flowers he was carrying and approaching the president. Slight advantage, and therefore, when Dr. One assigns her experiment subject, the protagonist stops her to tell her that if she chooses the person, the one who doesn't have the upper hand won't be able to demonstrate their product's advantages, and they will definitely lose. The doctor finally understands what the protagonist was telling him, and she ends up choosing the person with wrinkles. This impresses the people, since the doctor had chosen the highest difficulty factor, which is middle-aged wrinkles, because in the last 7 medical aesthetic contests, there has never been a successful precedent for wrinkle removal. But what is most impressive is that Cha's company gave up its specialty of acne removal in favor of scar removal in order to win the title, while the doctor's company chose to challenge the impossible, and therefore, we must wait and see if his choice stems from arrogance or confidence. However, upon opening her bottle, the doctor notices something that causes her to. I ask the protagonist what is happening, and the doctor replies that her product contains sulfuric acid. Because of this discovery, seeing that, she has every advantage to win. So she tells the doctor that, as she had said before, the doctor was not worthy of fighting her. However, the doctor knows very well that she was the one who tampered with her product, and therefore asks how he dares to steal and replace her product, and threatens to call the. He asks her to choose whether to be his wife or to go against him, to which she responds that she will decide whether or not to go against him when her headache passes. And as for being the president's wife, she tells him not to even think about it. These words made him quite angry, as we could see. Police. However, the protagonist asks the doctor if she has any proof. Faced with this and without hope of winning, the doctor tells the protagonist that they are clearly going to lose, but the protagonist tells him not to give up until the very end, even though the doctor says it's pointless, because he only had one bottle and he wasted his opportunity. Faced with this, the protagonist ends up calling the system to tell it to do it, asking if it can bear to see a pretty girl cry. However, the system tells him that, according to the host's negotiations, buy it, leading the protagonist to think there are solutions, but he doesn't know if he can buy it, and therefore he asks the system if he can request a loan. However, the system tells him that his company is too small and not. The doctor, he tells her that this can help them. Even if it can't be that expensive, it can help them. But there is a condition, and at the moment the doctor, one could attribute it to the fact that the protagonist, not knowing what else to do, could only apologize to the doctor for not giving her the championship, and hugging her. He tells the doctor that he can't, since it hurts his heart to see her that way. This is while he was saying to himself, what am I saying? Since he just had to give points. Literally, the protagonist was telling her all this so that the doctor would give him intimacy points. The system, seeing that the protagonist's words don't, that he looked like he wanted to hit the president. However, the president's bodyguard, noticing this, signals for him to calm down. Work. Tells him that if it doesn't come from the heart, there will be no points, which makes the protagonist play his last card. And while something was happening to, ask the protagonist what the condition was. The protagonist, overjoyed, looks at her and says, the condition is, you must be happy. These words captivated the doctor, who increased the protagonist's favorability to over 99. Hugging him, she tells the protagonist that he was amazing and, besides being very kind, Yo, who was observing everything, asks the doctor if she can't afford to lose, saying to her, so, as he had told her before, she wasn't worthy of beating him. This happens while the director also tells her that in the future, they would be the laughingstock of the beauty industry. However, the protagonist, faced with this, stares intently at him and tells him that it seems they are very happy. And here, the system shows us how the protagonist purchased the Fountain of Youth for 18 points, leaving him with 82 points remaining, and then hands the Fountain of Youth over to the doctor. He gives the Fountain of Youth to the doctor, telling her that it will work, and while staring intently at her, asks if she trusts him, to which the doctor replies that, of course, she does. Once the test begins, and each of the girls uses the product, someone says that the moment to witness the miracle and discover the winner of the grand finale has arrived. Chonan, looking very confident, tells the doctor that she has dominated her for 3 years at school, but today will be the day she tramples her as revenge. She will do it. He looked like he wanted to hit the president. However, the president's bodyguard, upon noticing this, gestured for him to calm down without saying a word. Years at school. But today is going to be the day he is going to trample her, and, as revenge, he will do it. But the doctor, who also seemed confident, she tells him the very thing she fears, that he's going to end up disappointing her. However, when the test subject doesn't reveal her face, we can see how the disfigurement she had decreased considerably thanks to the product. However, what surprised everyone, including me, was the product. From the doctor who, upon seeing her, look at this. No, I'm not going to say much. Just look at this. I'm going to show you a before and after of the lady. Wow, this is incredible, obviously. It impressed everyone who was there observing everything. and they were all left speechless. At this, the reporters rushed forward to take photos immediately, since it's incredible and, without a doubt, it's tomorrow's headline. That's what they said. Meanwhile, Cha was in shock, wondering how it was possible, how the doctor had managed to achieve such a feat. The reporters, they also inquired with the doctor about what kind of product she had used to rejuvenate people, but the doctor simply responded that this is her new source of immortality. He's trying to undermine the doctor's work, claiming she must have used some kind of hormone, and therefore, he requests the organization committee to intervene, which the protagonist clearly has no problem with, even telling him. However, he questions her authority to stop him, yelling that she shouldn't forget that her compensation comes from their group's funds, not Jalan's. Go ahead, there's no problem. However, after some time, and having examined the product, he concludes that after conducting tests, mimosas found no harmful ingredients in the Fountain of Youth, and as a result, they are now announcing that the winner of this year's Beauty of Medicine tournament is Tina Medical. This year's Beauty of Medicine award goes to Tina Medical. Dr. Chait Nan, shocked by the outcome, could only wonder how that was even possible. Looking at Miss Chown, she asks if she cheated, which Miss Chown confirms to the doctor, telling her that the title will be hers and that, no matter how hard she fights, she will only live in Chown's shadow for the rest of her life. The doctor can only ask, why, to which Chown, while embracing the man in the green jacket, replies that it is simply because this man is now interested in her. She, the doctor, seemed to know the man in the green jacket, as she mentioned that he is the vice president of the Chamber of Commerce. The man in the green jacket, upon seeing the protagonist, tells him that they meet again, to which the protagonist responds by saying that he knew there was a reason, is so toxic and already knows the reason why, and that is because he is after her, but she can clearly see that he is using underhanded tactics. The doctor, seeing that the protagonist and the man in the green jacket know each other, wonders to herself what kind of identity the protagonist has to be able to stand against a character like Jalan's salary, and threatens that if she dares to stop him again, he will immediately end her life and leave her sick little sister to die in the hospital. Vice President Gao, a major figure in IN, and also that the protagonist doesn't lose his cool. The man in the green jacket, seeing that the protagonist doesn't have many opportunities to win, telling him that he missed his only opportunity to stand out this time and will lose everything in 6 months, even telling the protagonist to beg him, maybe he will help him. However, the protagonist says he's sorry, but he doesn't like his abilities, which prompts the guy in the green jacket to ask the protagonist if he's stupid, and if he doesn't realize that he has already lost. However, the protagonist tells him that he hasn't lost yet, and raising his hand, says to the moderator that he suspects the drink has added illegal ingredients. Hearing this, the girl becomes quite agitated, but the guy in the green jacket tells her to calm down, since he has to let them test it, because he knows everything he did, and, if something goes wrong, he can quickly change it, which she has the girl tell him that he is exactly as she expected, since he can control everything, and they will definitely win. However, what they didn't count on, what they didn't expect, was that the protagonist would lower one of them to say that it is not necessary to do tests, since the test subjects are the best proof. This, and by showing the girl, we can see how she was disfigured again. However, we will be leaving this video here, so if you be Kata, if you liked it, leave your like, and without further ado, bye bro. Hospital. Hearing this, the protagonist finally realizes that this girl is one of his contract targets. However, when the redhead tried to strike the president's bodyguard, the protagonist intervened and stopped him, telling him to stop, once and for all. He answers the call and tells his girlfriend that he knew she wouldn't leave him alone. However, his girlfriend tells him that she failed her editorial exam, and they had to, for everything. But he retorted to the protagonist, asking how he dared to interfere in his family matters. Putting him in his place, the protagonist tells him to be polite. This impressed the girls, who never imagined that the protagonist he would dare to hit Li Yuan. In response, the red-haired man tells the protagonist that his father won't let him get away with this, but the protagonist, slapping him repeatedly, asks what if his father comes there, and even if that old prodigy were there, he would have defeated him. All the while, he's thinking that if he can't sign Yelan, he only has an hour to live, so what does he have to fear? After this, the protagonist ends up kicking the guy out of the place, but as he's leaving, he tells him to just wait, because he will definitely get revenge for what he did. And as the president witnessed all of this, she thought the protagonist was very impressive, and that, as a boss, he was a late bloomer, so she signed the protagonist's contract. She tells him that she has thought it over and believes in him, to which the protagonist overjoyed as he embraced the contract, told her that she was his goddess and his hope. At that moment, the system finally notified him that the Yelon contract award was successful and that he had been rewarded with 7 days of life, telling him that he had to check it, to which the protagonist, looking at the reward, said, "Okay," and wondered how it worked. Break up. A piece of news that made the protagonist's hair stand on end. You only need to see the look on his face when he heard the news. The system tells him that he must place it on the subject's back. However, at that moment, the president collapses again from a headache, but the protagonist catches her just in time and asks what's happening. Passing by, she replies that the reason she hesitated to sign the contract was because she had recently been suffering from headaches, mental euphoria, and memory loss. She fears she won't be able to do the new job. Now that she's signed the contract on impulse, she's afraid she won't. Can help him recover. Faced with this, the protagonist thinks that the rewards granted by the system belong to both parties of the contract, and the gods of fortune seem to be targeting her headache, so he tells her that he has learned some massage techniques, traditional Chinese, and it just might work. And when the protagonist proceeded to give the president a massage, her bodyguard tells the protagonist that he's being useless, since Miss Yellen has already been to all the famous hospitals and doctors, but no one can cure that migraine, and only he believes that he can improve it with a simple massage. However, when the protagonist placed the card on her head, the one that the system had given him, the card, which is the divine calculation, she ended up standing up and happily said that she felt like she was in heaven, since it was so relaxing. And while the protagonist, with tears in his eyes, asks his girlfriend why she is suddenly saying this, but she only tells him that she is sorry, since found herself panting with happiness. Her bodyguard told her that the pain was gone, asking if it wasn't incredible, something that she herself couldn't believe, that this worked better than a magic pill. And as Miss Yelon watched, the protagonist thanked her, because not only he sacrificed his life to save her, but he also cured the migraine that had been bothering her for so long, and she doesn't even know how she can possibly repay him for this. While we could observe how her intimacy level rose to 3, leading the protagonist to think that his actions can increase intimacy with those he has made a contract with. However, she suddenly remembers something, and as something happens to the protagonist, she tells him that there is something there that has to do with his father, to which the protagonist asks what she means about his father, which the president tells. The protagonist, whose and the president's mailboxes are only 1 digit apart, received the video by accident, claiming he was in too much of a hurry to take a closer look. However, he can confirm that his father died suspiciously and that he later forgot about it because he had a migraine. But now he remembers everything, telling the protagonist that they have to go to the police station to report it, which prompts the protagonist to say that, no matter who killed his father, he will make them pay in blood. After a while, as the protagonist and company were trying to leave the hospital, they are